The sound of the cotton gin was a persistent metallic grind, louder than any sound God intended to be heard. It was the sound of money being made, and it was the sound of the future being stolen. Elias Monroe stood half-shadowed by the barn, his gaze fixed on the dust motes dancing in the late September sun of 1879, Prince George County, Virginia. He had been a slave once. Now they called him a freedman. The irony was so brittle and sharp it could cut the wind. He was in his early 40s and built like a brick outhouse that had weathered a century of hurricanes. Every movement was economic, stripped of wasted effort, a residual habit from the years when wasted movement earned the whip. Now, those same hands, thicker and harder than any leather, were used to cultivate fields that belonged to Judd Kinsley. Kinsley had been an overseer before the war, a man whose authority stemmed from proximity to true power. Now Kinsley was the power, not through ownership of flesh, but through ownership of paper. Elias knew the land by its feel, its smell, and its rhythm. He knew how much a good stalk of cotton yielded, how many hours it took to pick 100 pounds, and what that 100 pounds was worth down to the single penny on the open market in Richmond. He knew his family, and every family on the Kinsley farm had produced enough this season to walk away clear, perhaps even with a few dollars jingling in their pockets, a miracle of sweat and prayer. But the ledger book, that heavy, leather-bound volume Kinsley guarded in his office, knew different. The ledger was the new master. It didn't need to raise a hand, it simply needed to subtract. Elias had been counting, though he was not a man of numbers. He counted seconds, breaths, steps. He counted the rust spots on the old scythe he favored, making sure it was sharp enough to slice the head off a stray copperhead. He counted the number of times Kinsley's foreman, a greasy man named Galt, checked his watch during the day, a pattern that suggested predictability, a pattern that suggested weakness. The debt system was elegantly simple and utterly ruinous. You worked Kinsley's land, you used Kinsley's tools, you lived in Kinsley's shacks, and you bought your necessities from the Kinsley Company store. The price is there: $1 for a bag of flour that cost 40 cents in town, $2 for boots that wore out in 3 months, were the chains. By the time the final tally came, the cost of living always, magically, exceeded the crop's value. You started the next year in debt, perpetual bondage, legally sanctioned. Judd Kinsley was not a large man, but he filled the space around him with loud, confident air, like a leaky gas balloon. He wore a crisp linen suit, untouched by the dust that stained the souls of the men who built his wealth. He liked to stand by the barn door, watching the weighed carts roll past, his small eyes glittering with proprietary greed. "Monroe," Kinsley called out, his voice sharp enough to draw blood. Elias stopped his cart. Kinsley never addressed Elias's wife Hannah directly, even though she was the one with the mind for figures. "Tell your woman to be on time for the final count. No use in delaying the inevitable, is there?" Elias didn't answer. He simply nodded, a slight, almost imperceptible dip of his massive head. Kinsley took the silence as deference. Everyone did. They mistook exhaustion and calculation for submission. "Good," Kinsley chuckled, patting the edge of the scythe handle sticking out of the cart. "Keep that steel clean, Monroe. It's expensive. Part of your debt, you understand." Elias held the scythe handle, his thumb tracing the curve of the steel blade where it met the wood. "The scythe is mine," he thought, a silent oath. "You paid for the scythe with my blood, not yours." The final tally day arrived with the suffocating heat of an Indian summer, the air thick with tension and the smell of dried cotton. The families gathered near the main barn, waiting in the shade, clutching small, carefully written slips of paper detailing their own counts. Hope was a fragile thing, easily crushed, but they held it anyway, believing that maybe this year the sheer volume of their labor would outweigh Kinsley's lies. Hannah Monroe stepped forward first. She was a woman of quiet fortitude, with eyes that saw deeper than dirt and a spirit that refused to be bowed. She carried her own ledger, a folded piece of parchment covered in tiny, precise script. She had been tracking every ounce, every expenditure, for 11 months. "Mr. Kinsley," Hannah said, her voice steady despite the trembling in her chest, "we picked 42 bales. After the costs of ginning and transportation, our share should be enough to cover the store ledger and leave us with near $30. Kinsley leaned back in his tall, spindly chair, placed deliberately on a makeshift platform so he was physically elevated above them. Galt stood beside him, holding a pistol casually in his right hand, eyes sweeping the crowd. Kinsley smiled. a thin, shark-like gesture that promised nothing good. 42 bales, Mrs. Monroe. Very good work, very good, Kinsley said, holding up his own massive ledger. He flipped through pages that were too clean, too neat, but you seem to be forgetting the cost of capital, and the interest on the seed, and the upkeep of the shacks. He paused, tapping a thick finger on a line of numbers. And the unexpected medical costs for your boy, Samuel, back in February. Hannah swallowed. Samuel broke his leg on your equipment, sir. It was $3 for the doctor's call, paid from the general fund. Ah, but the general fund is depleted, Mrs. Monroe. Depleted by the cost of your failure to monitor the boy. We paid the $3, yes, but we charge interest, of course, compound. And the price of molasses went up in July, which you signed for. And the loan for the mule... Kinsley trailed off, his pen scratching loudly on the paper, the sound magnified in the tense silence. He lifted his head, his smile wider, savoring the moment of absolute total control. The result, Mrs. Monroe, is that after all deductions, your account shows a current deficit of $58.14. A collective intake of breath swept through the crowd of sharecroppers. $58. It might as well have been $500. Hannah's face went pale, but her eyes, fixed on Kinsley's, remained defiant. That is incorrect, sir. We calculated... Your calculation means nothing, Mrs. Monroe. Mine is the only one that matters, because mine is backed by the law of the state of Virginia. Kinsley slammed the book shut. The sound was a definitive period on their year of sweat. $58, Elias, Kinsley said, finally looking at the big man standing silent behind his wife. That's what you owe me. The problem is you don't have it. You don't have anything I want except labor. Elias stepped forward, the dust crunching under his heavy boots. His chest was tight, not with fear, but with the cold, inevitable truth settling in his heart. They were still trapped. The law had changed the language, but not the chains. We will work it off next year, Hannah pleaded, her voice cracking now. We will work harder. Harder? Kinsley laughed, a dry, harsh sound. You already work like oxen, Mrs. Monroe. No, I need collateral. I need assurance. Kinsley leaned forward, his small eyes fixing on Samuel, the 16-year-old boy standing stiffly at the edge of the crowd. Samuel was gangly and quick, showing the promise of the man Elias had been before the trauma had settled in. The boy, Kinsley stated flatly. Samuel is old enough to be leased out. 6 months of his time working the rail lines in North Carolina should cover the principal and carry over enough credit for you to start the new season clear. I'll make arrangements tomorrow. The silence that followed was thick, suffocating. Leasing out labor. It was the selling of a child's time, the exact mechanism used to break up families 30 years prior. It was chattel slavery, dressed in the polite clothes of a debt contract. Hannah let out a small, wounded sound, reaching instinctively for Samuel, but the boy stood frozen, his eyes wide with betrayal. Elias did not move toward his wife or his son. He remained fixed on Judd Kinsley, his expression unreadable. But deep inside Elias, the switch flipped. The fear, the weariness, the decades of suppressed rage, they coalesced into a single, terrifyingly clear thought. You cannot fight the book with numbers. You must fight the book with fire. Kinsley misunderstood the silence. He saw surrender. He saw a strong, large man finally defeated by the complexity of finance. See, Monroe? No need for drama. It's business. Legitimate. Go back to your shack. Galt will fetch the boy at sunup. Elias looked at Samuel, and the boy saw something in his father's eyes that erased all the years of quiet submission. It wasn't love, not exactly. It was a promise, hard and unbreakable, forged in the heat of this betrayal. Elias turned, walking away from the barn and from the crowd. He walked past Hannah without touching her, past Samuel without looking back. He walked toward the tool shed, the scythe now calling to him like a dark priestess. In the moment Kinsley claimed Samuel's future, Elias realized that his own life had to be spent, immediately, for the ultimate good. He would trade 50 years of debt labor for a single afternoon of absolute terminal justice. He had been planning for freedom. Now, he was planning for reckoning. He reached the shed, pulling his favorite scythe from the rack. It was heavier than the newer models, better balanced. A weapon disguised as a necessity. He didn't rush. He didn't tremble. That tremor, the familiar psychological stutter of the oppressed, had vanished entirely. It had been replaced by a chilling calm. The plan was simple because it had to be perfect. Kinsley would be back in the barn tomorrow for the next family's tally. The harvest was still piled high. The guards Galt and another hired hand named Cole would be fat and complacent from the afternoon meal and the certain knowledge that their power was secure. Elias walked to the edge of the cotton field where the rows stretched out toward the woods. He tested the scythe, swinging it low and fast through the remaining stubble. This is not a tool for cutting weeds, he thought. This is a tool for cutting history. He spent the rest of the evening sharpening the edge, not with the rough stone but with a fine, slow grind. He worked under the cover of the shacks, where the firelight played tricks on the metal, turning the rust-pocked steel into a mirror of polished black intent. When Hannah finally came to him hours later, the terror in her eyes was mixed with confusion. "Elias, what are we going to do? Where will Samuel go? We can't let him take the boy." Elias stopped the sharpening, though he did not look up. He felt the cold weight of the scythe in his hands, the solid reality of the wood. "He won't," Elias said, his voice a low rumble. It was the first time he had spoken since the confrontation. "He won't take the boy." "How?" "We have nothing, Elias. Nothing they can't take." Elias finally raised his eyes. They were the color of cold river mud, and empty of everything except the future he had just decided upon. "He has the books, Hannah. That's what he takes. Not our labor, not the boy. The book." Hannah stared at him, unable to bridge the gap between his calm demeanor and the terrifying implication of his words. She tried to touch his arm, but he was already standing, the scythe resting against the wall, a shadow in the moonlight. "The books are locked in the office, Elias. Kinsley sleeps with the key on his neck." "Then we must ask him for the key." Elias turned, pulling on the heavy leather gloves he used for lifting the feed sacks. He looked at his wife, and in that look, she understood that she was talking to a ghost already walking among the living. "Go to Samuel. Tell him to wait. Tell him whatever happens, he is not to interfere. He is to run when he hears the thunder." He left the shed and walked toward the barn, the massive scythe hidden expertly beneath a tarp in his cart. He needed to study the final approach, the blind spots of the guards, the placement of the kerosene lamps. The reckoning had been ordered. The time for the payment was now. The next day dawned brutal and hot, the air still and heavy, as if holding its breath. Kinsley was in his glory, presiding over the final tally of the season. He hadn't slept well, having spent the early hours polishing his own sidearm in anticipation of potential trouble. He loved this part of the year, the mathematical proof that he, Judd Kinsley, was superior, untouchable. Around 4 p.m., the heat peaked. Kinsley, slightly flushed from a midday brandy and the success of his continued tyranny, called the next family forward. Galt and Cole leaned against the support beams, yawning, their vigilance dulled by routine and the oppressive temperature. Elias was waiting by the edge of the barn, ostensibly organizing tools. He saw Hannah and Samuel watching from a distance, their faces drawn. Hannah understood. She knew what sound the scythe made when it found resistance, and she knew what sound Kinsley's arrogance would make when it was shattered. The time was perfect. Kinsley was speaking, his voice pompous and irritating, detailing some outrageous charge for administrative costs to an old woman named Mama C. The other sharecroppers were sweating, heads bowed in resignation, waiting for the inevitable debt sentence. The focus was entirely on Kinsley's elevated platform. No one was watching the man who had stopped speaking. Elias stepped out of the shadow. He was moving but not running. It was a steady, deliberate stalk, the pace of a predator that knows its prey cannot escape. He reached into the cart, pulling the heavy scythe free. The polished blade caught the last brutal rays of the setting sun, flashing like a dark mirror. Kinsley finally saw him, interrupted mid-sentence by the sudden, chilling silence of the crowd. "Monroe, what in hell are you doing with that? Get back to work!" Kinsley demanded, reaching automatically for the revolver holstered at his hip. But Elias had counted Kinsley's reaction time years ago, measured against the speed of his own repressed fury. The scythe was already moving. It was not a swing. It was a devastating agricultural arc of pure righteous geometry. It was designed to clear fields, and now it cleared the path of the future. The blade hit Kinsley before the man's fingers even closed around the grip of the pistol. The sound was shockingly loud, sharp and final, a thick, wet sound that echoed off the high rafters of the barn. It was the sound of a system breaking. It was the thunder that Elias had promised. Kinsley didn't cry out. He simply fell, dragging the spindly chair and his precious ledger with him. The book hit the dusty floor with a heavy thud, spraying ink across the planks. Galt and Cole reacted a full 2 seconds too late. They drew their pistols, yelling curses. But the moment belonged entirely to Elias Monroe and the stunned, galvanized crowd. The horror of the act was immediate, but the response of the sharecroppers was even swifter. For years they had suffered under the cold calculation of those 2 hired guards. Now, with the master down, fear was instantly eclipsed by a terrifying, desperate freedom. Before Galt could aim, 3 men surged forward, seizing heavy wooden handles and broken tools. They weren't aiming to kill. They were aiming for chaos, for destruction of the symbols of their bondage. Cole, distracted by the sudden, silent rush, fired a shot high into the rafters. The flash of the gun was followed by the roar of the crowd, a sound Elias had never heard. Not a scream of pain, but a declaration of collective will. Elias ignored the fray. He moved past the collapsed Kinsley, past the fighting guards, toward the ledger book lying open on the floor. It was the heart of the monster, and it needed to die. He knelt, not in supplication, but in focus. He gently scooped up the heavy book, pages already damp with the cost of its creation. He did not read the debt entries. He didn't need to. He knew the truth of its contents. From his pocket, Elias pulled the kerosene lamp he had prepared. The glass was warm, the oil full. He tipped the lamp over the pile of cotton harvest near the wall, ignoring the shouts of the fighting men. The oil soaked the dry cotton instantly. Elias struck the match. The tiny, fragile flame blossomed. He opened the ledger book to the center and placed the lit match on the damp page. He watched the flames lick up the edges, turning the columns of deceit into curling black ash. The fire took hold with terrifying speed. The dry, dusty cotton and wood exploded into hungry flames, quickly consuming the evidence of a year's work and a century of oppression. The rising smoke, thick and acrid, signaled the end of the brief riot. Galt and Cole, battered and terrified by the sudden uprising of the men they thought they owned, fled the barn, running blindly toward the woods. Elias Monroe remained kneeling in the center of the rapidly growing inferno. He watched the flames consume the ledger, his face bathed in the hot orange light. The debt was being paid, line by line, page by page. He saw his own entry burn, and then Hannah's, and then Samuel's. He had bought their freedom. The cost was his own life, a simple, necessary transaction. Elias stood slowly, the ruined scythe dropping from his hand. He walked out of the barn, ignoring the heat licking at his back, stepping over the threshold and into the cool evening air. He did not run. He did not look for Hannah or Samuel. He walked 10 paces into the dusty yard and sat down heavily, his shoulders slumping, watching the Kinsley barn, the symbol of their economic prison, burn against the darkening Virginia sky. He sat there until the hoofbeats arrived. The local sheriff, Sterling, and 3 armed men rode hard into the yard, drawn by the smoke and the distant, fearful silence. Sheriff Sterling saw the scene: the burning barn, the discarded scythe, the 2 terrified, wounded guards emerging from the woods, and the still massive figure of Elias Monroe sitting calmly in the yard, his hands resting on his knees. Sterling dismounted slowly, drawing his rifle. He didn't need to ask questions. The message was clear. "Monroe," Sterling called out, his voice cautious. "You started this fire." Elias looked up at the sheriff. For the first time in 30 years, Elias Monroe felt truly, completely free. "The book is paid for," Elias said, his voice husky from disuse, but firm. Sterling didn't understand the words, but he understood the consequence. He understood the destruction. He understood the terrible, terrifying possibility that this one act of reckoning might encourage others. Elias offered no resistance when the chains were placed on his wrists. He simply watched the fire until the last page of Kinsley's ledger turned to ash. He was already a dead man walking, but he had purchased life for those he left behind, proving that the chains of debt could in fact be broken, if you were willing to pay the highest price with fire and thunder. The jail in Richmond was not built to hold men. It was built to hold property. It was stone and cold, a permanent structure of neglect that smelled of sour waste and desperation. Elias, shackled ankle to wrist, did not rail against the injustice. He sat in the darkness, allowing the damp air to permeate his ragged clothes, measuring the silence. Silence had been a luxury on the plantation. Here it was a weapon used against him, designed to let the terror of his fate seep into his bones. But Elias had paid his debt with fire, and the payment had left him hollowed out. immune to the simple terrors of confinement. The burning of the ledger had been the true reckoning, not the rope awaiting him. His body was caged, but his mind was already free, already calculating the ripple effect of his action. He knew they would make an example of him, but examples were double-edged. Kinsley had used fear as a currency. Elias had just shown them that currency could be spent on defiance. Back on the scorched grounds of the Kinsley plantation, the stench of ruin mingled with the smell of wet ashes. The White family had evacuated to town, leaving behind the overseer, Mr. Crawley, whose temper, previously controlled by Kinsley's strict profit-driven calculation, was now unbound. Crawley knew the fear was a temporary shield. If the enslaved community did not fear him more than they respected Elias's final act, the whole system on the property would crumble. They were forced to clear the rubble, a grotesque parody of labor, removing the charred remnants of the very documents that proved their chattel status. But as they worked, digging through the sodden papers and burned wood, they did not speak of Elias. They spoke of the rain, of the coming harvest, of anything mundane. Their silence was a shared language, deeper and more dangerous than any coded phrase. It was the silence of a packed spring, ready to recoil. The person who understood this language best was Sarah, the cook. Sarah was 52, her hands gnarled from 4 decades of peeling, chopping, and stirring, but her mind was sharp as a honed blade. She hadn't seen Elias's act, but she smelled the smoke and felt the shift in the air, the sudden, impossible possibility. She knew Elias hadn't just burned paper. He had burned the record of debt. The master, whatever new one arrived, would have to start from scratch. More importantly, Elias had shattered the illusion that the white man's ownership was absolute. He had chosen death over subjugation and, in doing so, had redefined the terms of engagement for everyone else. Crawley, in his blind rage, intensified the labor, doubling the hours and quadrupling the lashings for minor infractions. But the beatings now felt performative. When John was whipped for slackening pace, he didn't scream the way he used to. He held his breath, enduring it, his eyes fixed on some point beyond Crawley's shoulder. Crawley saw compliance, but Sarah saw a man conserving energy for something that truly mattered. Sarah had been preparing for years without knowing it. She ran the kitchen, the true nervous system of the plantation. She knew the comings and goings, the habits of the drivers, the weaknesses in the locks, but most crucially, she knew the plants. Granny Elvira, years before, had taught her the difference between a tonic and a curse, the line between healing and irreversible sleep. That week, as Elias's execution date approached, set by the Richmond court as a public warning, Sarah focused on a specific task: preserving the meat. The air was heavy, warm, hinting at an early summer rot, making preservation crucial. She moved barrels of salt and curing spices into the smokehouse, a building far enough from the main house to offer a measure of privacy, yet close enough to the edge of the woods. "You working too slow, woman," Crawley spat, kicking a loose plank near the kitchen door. Sarah did not look up. Her hands, thick and steady, continued to layer salt and herbs onto a side of pork. "Too much meat for this heat, Master Crawley. Got to take care of it proper, or you won't have none come winter." The mention of winter and profit always calmed the overseer marginally. He valued the stored provisions more than he valued the life of the enslaved. "Just get it done," he grumbled, retreating to the cooling shade of the porch. In the smokehouse, Sarah carefully arranged the meat, but under the heavy cuts of pork, she began to cache different provisions: sacks of parched corn, dried beans, small containers of lard. And tucked into the rafters, hidden among the drying herbs, she placed the most vital items: 2 rusty but serviceable skinning knives and a small roll of linen bandages. Elias had bought them time. Sarah was making sure they wouldn't waste it on starvation or exposed wounds. The court proceedings 3 days later were swift and brutal. The judge, a stout man with a face like cured ham, read the charges: arson, attempted murder due to the fire spreading near Kinsley's study, and the ultimate charge, insurrection against lawful property. Elias stood silent. He had been scrubbed and dressed in clean, rough clothes for the spectacle, making him look less like a demon and more like a man. This frustrated the prosecutor, who wanted a monster for the crowd. "Defendant Elias, do you deny setting fire to the property of Master Kinsley?" the prosecutor bellowed, leaning over the wooden railing. Elias finally spoke, his voice dry from the dust of the jail cell, but steady. "I deny nothing." And do you understand the gravity of your crime? That you destroyed valuable instruments of commerce and almost ended the life of a respectable gentleman? Elias raised his chained wrists, the metal biting into his skin. He looked past the judge, past the rows of onlookers, finding the narrow sliver of sunlight streaming through a high window. That paper wasn't commerce, sir. It was poison, Elias said, his voice low but carrying an undeniable resonance in the silent chamber. And I burnt the poison. The judge pounded his gavel. Silence! You dare lecture this court on legality? You are property, and property has no right to opinion, much less action. Elias lowered his gaze, satisfied. He had said his piece. The verdict was a foregone conclusion. Elias was to be hanged by the neck until dead, publicly next Saturday morning, in the main square of Richmond, to serve as a terror to all others who contemplated such treason. The pronouncement of death had an unexpected effect on the enslaved community awaiting the news. Instead of breaking them, it crystallized their resolve. The time was fixed. They had exactly 6 days until the execution. A young man named Caleb, 20 years old and strong as an ox, the son of the former blacksmith, approached Sarah in the dark of the smokehouse late that night. "Auntie Sarah," he whispered, his shadow long and flickering in the weak lantern light. "They say Saturday. They'll have every eye on the square." Sarah did not turn from the beans she was sorting. "And where will their eyes not be, Caleb? The river crossings, the swamp roads, the edge of the woods by the old oak." "Correct. When a master cracks the whip, the hand that holds it is looking at the wound, not the escape route." Caleb helped her load a small, heavy sack with the provisions. They understood the plan implicitly. Elias's death would be the ultimate distraction. The sight of a man, even a man they knew, swinging from the gallows would draw every local white man, every curious townsman, and every available patrol officer to the square. It would be the moment of maximum vulnerability for the surrounding area. But an immediate large-scale flight was impossible. The risk of mass capture was too high. The success of Elias's fire was not measured in instant freedom, but in the purchase of time and selective opportunity. Sarah's plan was calculated, based on decades of observation. Kinsley's plantation was connected to 4 smaller adjacent properties that also relied heavily on the security patrols centered around the Kinsley main house. If Kinsley was in chaos, so were they. The focus shifted from immediate freedom to securing the vulnerable. Sarah, using the network of kitchens and field hands, spread the word, not of escape, but of gathering for the morning. On Wednesday, 2 days before the execution, Sarah took the salt-cured meat and delivered it to the main house kitchen, under the suspicious eye of a temporary cook brought in from town. She made sure to leave the largest piece of meat, heavily salted, seemingly preserved, on a high shelf, just out of immediate reach, but easily visible. She knew Crawley would be hungry and lazy, and he would take the easiest meal. That night, she slipped into the slave quarters of the neighboring property, known as Bell Grove, whose master, Mr. Hawthorne, was notoriously lax but excessively cruel when provoked. She met with an elder woman there, whispering details of the Saturday plan. They weren't running yet. They were preparing for the opening of the path. The night air was thick with humidity, and the atmosphere on the Kinsley land was heavy with dread and anticipation. Elias was a figure of profound sorrow, but also a silent hero. Every flicker of the lamp in the quarters, every whispered prayer, was an acknowledgement of his sacrifice. By Friday evening, the fear had reached its peak. The patrols were thick, anticipating trouble before the public hanging. Sarah moved with deliberate slowness. She prepared the final meal for the main house staff, a meager stew for Crawley and the replacement field driver. In the stew, she included a specific herb, not poison, not yet. Just enough of a potent natural sedative, disguised perfectly by garlic and pepper, to ensure the overseer and the driver would sleep soundly, too deeply to hear the soft tread of feet or the turning of a lock. Caleb, meanwhile, had used the distraction of the execution preparation to his advantage. The road leading from the plantation to Richmond had seen constant traffic as supplies and guards moved into town. He noticed the weakness. A section of the outer perimeter fence, usually reinforced with sharp wire, had been temporarily removed to allow a lumber wagon to pass through. It had not been properly replaced. Caleb spent the twilight hours moving slowly through the dense brush near that weak point, pretending to hunt stray fowl. He wasn't hunting. He was mapping the best path into the thickets, a path that led not north toward the famous railroads, but south, deep into the dangerous, snake-infested marshlands, the places no white man would willingly follow, especially not when the grand spectacle of justice was unfolding miles away in the town square. He returned to the quarters just before the curfew bells chimed. He caught Sarah's eye. She nodded almost imperceptibly, confirming the sedative would take effect soon after midnight. "It will be tomorrow morning," Caleb whispered to his brother Thomas, "when the cannon fires in town." Thomas's eyes, usually wide with fear, narrowed to slits of determination. The cannon. That's the signal. The sacrifice of Elias was about to pay its first dividend. The cannon blast announcing his hanging would be heard for miles, the sound of the system triumphing. But for the small, carefully selected group on the Kinsley property, that sound would be the signal for liberation, bought not with gold, but with the highest price imaginable. The cost of one man's life was about to be leveraged against the system itself, turning the symbol of their oppression into the catalyst for their freedom. The night deepened, cold and pregnant with the silent violence of a calculated withdrawal. Ellie's selected group on the Kinsley property, that sound would be the signal for liberation, bought not with gold, but with the highest price imaginable. The cost of one man's life was about to be leveraged against the system itself, turning the symbol of their oppression into the catalyst for their freedom. The night deepened, cold and pregnant with the silent violence of a calculated withdrawal. Josiah huddled low behind the root cellar, the cold iron shovel pressed into the mud beside him, smelling of damp earth and rust. 27 people waited in the darkness. Not all of them strong, not all young, but all bound by the absolute necessity of this night. They were waiting for the silence to break and then, immediately, for the silence to return. Elijah had promised that window, the moment of shock, the critical 5 minutes when chaos would be centered on the big house, allowing them to slip the yoke of the perimeter. Josiah watched the cookhouse chimney stack, a dark finger against the stars. The fire was banked, the house sleeping. Everything depended on the precision of one man 2 miles away, hidden in the shadows of the master's study, a man who 3 years ago had sworn he would rather face the whip daily than risk a single child. But the calculus had changed. When the overseer had taken Elijah's youngest son, the cost of endurance had finally exceeded the cost of resistance. The air itself seemed taut, ready to snap. Josiah could hear his own blood thrumming in his ears, louder than the faint rustle of the dry cornstalks. His wife, Lena, pressed against the cold brick wall beside him, her breathing shallow and controlled. They had rehearsed this moment 100 times in the quiet monotony of the fields, a map drawn not on parchment, but etched into the deep memory of their bones. The path through the broken fence line, past the abandoned well, skirting the swamp edge, always moving toward the great river. The sound came not as the gunshot they had half expected, nor the scream of a victim, but something far more chilling. The abrupt, heavy thud of something weighty dropping onto thick Persian rug, instantly absorbed, instantly silenced. It was finished. Josiah inhaled sharply, tasting the cold night air and the metallic tang of sudden adrenaline. No sound followed, no cry of alarm. Elijah had been clean. "Now," Josiah whispered, the word escaping his throat like a puff of steam. The 27 moved with an economy of motion born of desperation and long practice. They flowed into the fields, not running wildly, but utilizing the long shadows cast by the moonless sky and the cover of the late-season crops. The children were carried, small burdens wrapped tightly in dark blankets, trained to absolute silence, a silence that felt more dangerous than any noise. Every footfall was carefully placed, every breath was rationed. The distance between the slave quarters and the safety of the wilderness was a gauntlet measured in terror. They crossed the main road, the hard-packed dirt unforgiving and loud. Josiah risked a glance back toward the Kinsley manor. Still dark, but the night was not empty. A dog began to bark far off near the north gate. It was not the familiar lazy yelp of the hounds used to chase rabbits. This was sharp, insistent, the sound of an animal sensing wrongness in the order of the estate. "Faster," Josiah urged, pushing the group toward the tangled underbrush that marked the boundary of the river swamp. They were perhaps half a mile past the boundary line when the first sign of disaster flashed. A light flickered in the upstairs window of the manor house, a single dancing flame quickly growing into a sickly orange glow. Someone had discovered the disruption. The alarm came moments later, tearing the calculated silence to shreds. A high, raw shriek, followed by the frantic ringing of the house bell, signaling not a fire, but an invasion, an existential horror. Soon, the horn began to blow, the deep, mournful sound carrying across the fields and telling every white man within 5 miles that Kinsley was under assault. They were too far ahead for the alarm to stop them instantly, but the pace had to change. They plunged into the swamp, the cold water rising instantly to their knees, sucking at their feet with greedy, muddy sighs. The swamp was their protector and their impediment, slowing the chase but draining their strength. Josiah knew the master's horses would be saddle-ready within minutes, but the riders would hesitate at the swamp's edge, preferring the dry ground. They had perhaps 20 minutes before the riders would deploy the dogs, the true hunters of the darkness. Josiah turned to a tall, steady man named Caleb, the sulphur. "Now," Caleb nodded, his face a mask of grim determination. They had prepared for this. Reaching into his canvas bag, Caleb pulled out small, carefully wrapped bundles of soaked sulphur and black powder, stolen over months from the plantation stores under the guise of curing hides. The plan was not to stop the dogs, but to confuse them, to introduce a scent so foul and unnatural that it would burn their sensitive noses and ruin the track. They deployed the bundles quickly, tossing them into the shallow water and along the most obvious paths of entry into the swamp. As Caleb struck flint against steel, a faint, acrid smoke began to rise, smelling of the pits of hell, a chemical defense against the natural order of the hunt. The hounds' baying grew closer, a rising tide of fury and hunger. They were almost at the edge of the woods. "Go! Don't look back!" Josiah yelled, shoving Lena and the others deeper into the dark embrace of the cypress knees. The hounds hit the sulphur line, and the noise broke into confused, choked yelps, quickly followed by the enraged shouts of the riders who had dismounted to control them. It bought them perhaps 5 minutes of chaos, but that chaos came at a price. The riders, frustrated, began to fire blind into the woods. One shot struck the old woman, Ilara, not cleanly, but ripping across her thigh. She fell without a sound, a testament to decades of forced silence, dragging herself deeper into the muck. Josiah hauled her up, throwing her arm over his shoulder, the weight of her body a sudden, terrible drag. "We can't stop," she gasped, her voice barely a thread. "The river. Go." He ignored her, driven by a primal need to keep the group intact. They reached the riverbank, a wide, fast-moving ribbon of cold water. On the far side, the land promised high ground and, eventually, a path to the underground railroad network, maintained by a Quaker community 50 miles north. The boat was exactly where Elijah had sworn it would be, a large, flat-bottomed ferry scow hidden deep beneath overhanging willows, stolen weeks prior from a distant logging operation. Loading the group was a slow, agonizing process. They had to be silent, steady and quick, fighting against the current and the rising tide of panic. Lena took the children, organizing them in the center of the scow. Josiah, Caleb, and 3 other men held the rope, pulling the vessel against the bank. As the last person scrambled aboard, the riders burst through the trees behind them, their torches blazing like vengeful eyes. The sulphur had dissipated enough for the dogs to find the scent again, and the lead hounds reached the riverbank, barking hysterically, tasting the raw fear and the cold water. The master of Kinsley, Mr. Aldridge, was not among the riders, a detail Josiah noted with a grim satisfaction. Elijah's work had been thorough, but Aldridge's eldest son, a brute named Thomas, stood screaming orders on the bank, a rifle raised to his shoulder. "Stop, or I swear I'll shoot the whole damned lot of you." Thomas's voice cracked with frustrated rage. Josiah knew the scow was too big and the river too wide for Thomas to hit anyone accurately in the darkness, but he dared not risk the children. He released the holding rope. The scow lurched into the current, gaining speed, drifting downriver. "Go, Josiah! Get on!" Lena screamed from the boat, her face catching the torchlight, etched with terror and hope. Josiah knew he could not make it. He was carrying Ilara's wound, and the weight of the moment held him fast to the mud. He looked Thomas Aldridge in the eye across the wide, swirling expanse of the water. He didn't run. He didn't plead. He picked up the iron shovel he still carried, a simple tool of labor, and threw it with a grunt of spent energy into the river. The splash was defiant. "You won't catch us," Josiah yelled, his voice rough but clear, a voice that had not spoken such defiance in 3 decades. "You only got the silence left now." He turned then, not toward the river but deeper into the woods, leading the pursuing riders on a desperate, solitary path away from the escaping scow. He was running a diversion, a final act of payment for the liberation of the 27. He ran toward the north, drawing the sound of the hounds and the shouts of the riders further and further away from the river, away from the path of freedom. The river scow, carrying its improbable cargo of hope, moved swiftly, silently down the dark current. No one looked back again. They listened only to the sound of the river and the receding cacophony of the hunt, a sound that finally faded to a distant, despairing noise swallowed by the deep woods. They knew intuitively what Josiah was doing, buying them time, buying them miles, buying their lives with his own. The journey north lasted 47 harrowing days. They traveled almost exclusively at night, guided by the cold precision of the North Star and the sporadic assistance of the network's brave conductors. They were hungry, sick, and perpetually terrified, but they were together. When they finally reached the welcoming lights of the free community in southern Ohio, hidden deep in the hills, they were 26. Ilara, the old woman wounded by the bullet, succumbed to fever 3 days before they crossed the state line. They buried her quickly, quietly, marking her grave only with a smooth river stone, her sacrifice a silent addition to Josiah's. Kinsley Plantation burned 3 days after the escape. Not the main house, that was left intact, a grim mausoleum for the deceased master, but the storage barns, the smokehouse, and the cotton gin. The official report stated the fires were set by unspecified vagrants. The local press hinted at rebellion, but the planters quickly suppressed the narrative, unwilling to admit the possibility that those they owned could possess such calculated agency. The death of the master was ruled an accident, a fall, perhaps, in the night. The 27 vanished into the footnotes of local history, erased by official denial. But for the remaining 46 enslaved individuals left behind at Kinsley, and for the hundreds on surrounding properties, the truth was indelible. Josiah's sacrifice, Elijah's calculated risk, the brutal, effective precision of their actions. It cracked the facade of permanent control. The system required absolute compliance, absolute silence. When that silence was broken by calculated violence, followed not by fearful screams, but by organized silent departure, it created a tremor that no amount of official denial could suppress. Lena never remarried. She settled in Ohio, working as a washerwoman, her hands perpetually rough but no longer trembling. Her children, raised free, grew up knowing their father was not a victim, but an architect of liberation, a man whose life had been spent paying the final, exorbitant price of freedom. Years later, in 1863, when the war was raging and the Emancipation Proclamation was signed, the Kinsley property lay abandoned, its fields fallow and overgrown. Locals whispered that the silence of the manor house was unnatural, burdened by the ghosts of the 27 who had walked away, and the 2 men who paid for their passage. The silent withdrawal was never documented in history books. It was too small, too localized, too inconvenient for the grand narrative of war and liberation. But in the stories whispered around cooking fires in the free communities of Ohio and Pennsylvania, Josiah and Elijah became the myth, the men who understood that the true cost of freedom was the exact price they placed on their own dignity, leveraging it against the rotten core of the system until it had no choice but to collapse. The last image Lena carried of Josiah was not of his fear, but of his final defiant act, throwing the iron shovel into the dark, churning water. It was a refusal of his assigned function, a declaration that his hands, which had only known labor and servitude, would now only touch freedom. The sound of that splash, heard only by the water and the terrified riders, echoed in her memory long after the sounds of the war faded. It was the sound of a debt paid in full.